The ring of Vorath cadets closed around me before I even finished checking the weapon in my hand. 12 of them, each one taller than me by at least a foot, each one built like something designed to hunt for a living, because that is exactly what their species was built to do. I stood in the middle of the training circle on Meridian Station, holding a small device that looked more like a flashlight than a weapon, and I could hear soft growls of laughter rolling through the group. My name is Grace Sullivan. I was not supposed to be the one standing here. 6 months ago, I was training new recruits back on Earth, teaching them how to stay calm when everything around them told them to panic. Now I was standing on an alien space station, surrounded by cadets from a species that saw humans as something between a curiosity and a joke, holding a weapon that the Vorath High Command had officially labeled harmless. The device in my hand was called a neural disruptor baton. It did not cut, it did not burn, it sent a short, sharp pulse into the nervous system of anything it touched, scrambling signals just long enough to drop a target to the ground. Human engineers built it to end a fight without ending a life. The Vorath called it a toy. They said this to my face, more than once, in the days leading up to this demonstration. I had been sent here as part of an exchange program between Earth and the Vorath Dominion, a program built on paper-thin trust and a shared fear of something bigger than either of our species. The official reason for my visit was simple. I was to demonstrate human close-quarters training methods to a group of elite cadets, the best of their generation, chosen from thousands of applicants across a dozen worlds. The real reason, the one nobody said out loud, was that the higher-ups on both sides wanted to know exactly how far humans could be pushed, and how hard we could push back. The cadet standing closest to me was named Threxer. He had pale gray skin, a jaw built for tearing, and eyes that never seemed to blink. He was the top student in his class, and everyone on this station knew it, including him. He looked down at me with the kind of smile a predator gives its prey, right before deciding it is not worth the effort of chasing. "This is what they send us," he said, his voice deep and rough, translated a half-second late through the small device clipped to my collar. A soft one, with a toy. The other cadets laughed. It was not a friendly sound. I did not answer right away. I had learned a long time ago that silence made people nervous, especially people who expected a reaction. Instead, I looked past Threxer to the platform above the training ring, where Commander Voss stood watching with his arms folded behind his back. Voss was the senior instructor for this class, a veteran of the Dominion's border conflicts, and the one who had personally requested this demonstration. He had made no secret of his opinion that humans were a soft species, more suited to negotiation than combat. He wanted proof. Beside him stood my own commanding officer, Colonel Daniel Cross, a man who had spent 30 years in the service and had seen enough to know that quiet people were often the most dangerous ones in the room. He caught my eye for just a moment and gave the smallest nod. It was not permission, it was trust. "You may begin whenever you are ready, Instructor Sullivan," Voss called down, his tone dripping with something close to amusement. "Show my cadets what your species considers a weapon." I turned back to face Threxer, and the 11 cadets spread out around him in a loose circle. This was supposed to be a simple demonstration. Strike a training dummy, explain the mechanics, answer a few questions, and be done within the hour. That was the plan written on paper back at headquarters. But plans written on paper rarely survive contact with a room full of young predators who have never once been told no. I raised the baton and activated the demonstration dummy set up at the edge of the ring, a padded frame built to absorb a strike and register the results on a screen above it. I explained, as calmly as I could, how the device worked. I told them it did not cause lasting harm. I told them it was designed to end a confrontation quickly, without permanent injury to either side. I struck the dummy once, lightly, and the screen above it flashed with numbers showing the disruption pattern, the kind of information their engineers would care about far more than their fighters would. Threxer was not impressed. None of them were. "A weapon that does not draw blood is not a weapon," he said, stepping forward, closing the distance between us until he was close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. "It is a warning, and warnings mean nothing to us." I felt the air in the room shift. The other cadets stopped laughing. They started watching, the way a pack watches when one of its members decides to test something new. "I understand you find this unimpressive," I said, keeping my voice level, the same voice I used with new recruits who thought they already knew everything. "But this weapon was designed for exactly this kind of situation, a situation where I need to stop a threat without ending a life. You think we are a threat?" Threxer's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "That is the funniest thing you have said since you arrived on this station." I did not step back. Stepping back would have told him everything he wanted to know, that his size and his confidence were enough to move me, that his species truly was the apex of everything worth being afraid of. I had spent years learning that the size of a threat was never the whole story. What mattered was what happened in the seconds after the first move, and whether you were the one who controlled them. "I am not here to prove anything about threats," I said. "I am here to teach a technique. That is all." Voss's voice cut through the tension from above, smooth and patient, the voice of a man who already believed he knew how this would end. "Cadet Threxer, step back and allow the instructor to continue." Threxer did not step back. Instead, he reached out, faster than I expected, and closed his hand around the baton in my grip, not violently, but firmly enough to make his point. His claws, retracted but still visible along the edge of his fingers, brushed against the back of my hand. "Show me," he said quietly, so only I could hear it through the translator. "Show me what your soft species considers strength." The room went very still. 11 other cadets watched their leader hold my weapon in his grip, waiting to see whether I would pull away, whether I would call for help, whether I would do anything at all except stand there and take it. I understood in that moment that this was never going to be a simple demonstration. This was a test, one that Threxer had decided to run the second I walked into that ring, and every cadet standing around us already knew the answer he expected me to give. I gave him a different one. I did not pull the baton away. I did not raise my voice. I looked directly into those unblinking eyes and said, calmly, clearly, in a tone that left no room for translation error, "This is your only warning. Let go, and we continue the lesson as planned." Threxer laughed, and this time every cadet around him laughed with him, a low rolling sound that filled the training ring like distant thunder. He tightened his grip on the baton, testing whether I would fight him for it, testing whether there was any strength behind the calm voice of the human standing in front of him. I felt the weight of every set of eyes in that room. Voss watching from above with his arms still folded, waiting to see his prediction confirmed. Colonel Cross standing beside him, silent, patient, trusting me to handle a moment he could not step in and control. 11 cadets closing the circle just slightly tighter, sensing that whatever happened next was not going to be part of the lesson plan anymore. Threxer leaned down until his face was inches from mine, his breath warm against my skin, his voice dropping to something almost gentle, almost curious. "One warning," he repeated, tasting the words like he found them amusing. "And what happens if I do not listen?" I did not answer him with words. I answered him by finally, calmly, taking back control of the weapon in my hand, and in that small motion, in the way my fingers moved, and his claws did not quite react fast enough to stop me, something changed in his eyes. For the first time since I had arrived on Meridian Station, I saw the smallest flicker of doubt cross the face of a Vorath cadet who had never once believed a human could surprise him. Behind him, the other 11 cadets shifted their weight, moving closer, tightening the circle around us both. This was no longer a demonstration for the benefit of Commander Voss and his careful notes. This was something the cadets had decided among themselves, a test that had nothing to do with the lesson I had come here to teach, and everything to do with proving, once and for all, whose species truly belonged at the top of the food chain. I took a slow breath, feeling the familiar calm settle over me the way it always did in the seconds before everything moved very fast. 12 cadets. One weapon rated non-lethal, a room full of people who believed they already knew exactly how this would end. They were about to find out how wrong they were. Threxer straightened up slowly, pulling his hand back from the baton, and for a moment, I thought the test was over. I thought maybe the flicker of doubt I had seen in his eyes meant something, that he would step back into line and let the lesson continue the way it was supposed to. I was wrong. Predators do not back down from doubt. They lean into it, because doubt is the one thing their culture has taught them never to show in front of a pack. Interesting, Threxer said, circling around me now, slow and deliberate, the way a hunter circles something it has not yet decided whether to respect. You held on to it. Most soft species would have let go the moment I touched them. I am not most species, I said, turning with him, keeping him in front of me, refusing to let him move to a position where I could not see him clearly. Behind me, I could feel the other cadets shifting, spreading out just slightly, the loose circle around us tightening by inches. Commander Voss leaned forward against the railing above the ring, and for the first time since I had arrived on Meridian Station, I saw something other than amusement on his face. It was not concern, it was closer to interest, the kind of interest a scientist has when an experiment stops behaving the way the textbook said it would. "Cadet Threxer," Voss called down, his voice carrying an edge of warning now. "This demonstration is meant to be instructional, not a contest of strength. Return to your position." Threxer did not look up at his commander. He kept his eyes on me, and I understood in that moment that whatever respect he held for Voss did not extend to backing down in front of 11 of his classmates. On his world, and I had read enough about Vorath culture during my briefings to know this, a cadet who backed away from a challenge in front of his pack lost more than pride. He lost standing that could take years to rebuild. "With respect, Commander," Threxer said, still circling, still watching me the way a predator watches something that has just done the unexpected. "I believe the instructor wishes to continue the lesson." She said as much herself. It was a clever twist of my own words, and I recognized it for what it was. He was not asking permission. He was building a justification, one that would let him push further while still appearing to follow the rules of the exercise. I glanced up at Colonel Cross, and his expression told me everything I needed to know. He was not going to step in. This was still my demonstration to run, and stepping in now would tell every Vorath on this station that humans could not handle pressure without help from the outside. I understood then that the only way out of this was through it. "Fine," I said, loud enough for all 12 cadets to hear. "Let us continue the lesson." Threxer's grin widened, and he glanced back at his classmates, a silent signal passing between them that I recognized immediately, even without understanding a word of their language. It was the look of a group deciding, together, that the rules had just changed. The cadet to my left moved first, a broad-shouldered Vorath with a scar running down one side of his face, closing the distance between us in 2 long strides. I did not wait to see what he intended to do. I had spent enough years reading body language across dozens of different training environments to know that a predator closing distance that fast, with claws beginning to extend from beneath his fingertips, was not planning to ask polite questions. I moved. The baton in my hand connected with his forearm before his claws could fully extend, a short, precise strike that sent a pulse of disruption straight into the network of nerves running from his shoulder to his fingertips. He did not fall immediately. Vorath physiology, according to the files I had studied for weeks before this assignment, was denser and more resilient than human physiology in almost every measurable way. But his arm went slack, his fingers curling uselessly, and the surprise on his face was almost enough to make me feel sorry for him. Almost. "She struck him," someone said from the group, disbelief coloring the translated words. "She actually struck him." I did not have time to answer. The moment the first cadet stumbled back, clutching his arm, 2 more surged forward from opposite sides of the circle, and I understood immediately that this was no longer a test between me and Threxer alone. This was the entire pack deciding, in the space of a single heartbeat, that the human standing in their training ring needed to be put back in her place. I dropped low, letting the first strike from my right pass over my shoulder, close enough that I felt the displaced air against my neck. My training had never been about matching strength for strength. It had been built around a simple idea, one that human close-quarters instructors had refined over decades of conflict against enemies who were often bigger, stronger, and better armed. Speed and precision beat raw power, every single time, if you use them correctly. I brought the baton up and across, catching the second cadet along the side of his ribs as he overextended his reach trying to grab me. The pulse hit him mid-stride, and his legs buckled beneath him, sending him crashing into the padded flooring of the training ring with a sound that echoed off the walls of the observation deck above. 2 down, 10 to go, and the ring had gone completely silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the low, confused growls of cadets who had never imagined this fight would go anywhere except in their favor. Threxer's expression had changed entirely now. The amusement was gone, replaced by something sharper, something that looked almost like respect fighting against disbelief. He raised a hand, and for a moment I thought he might call off the rest of his classmates. Instead, he gestured, and the remaining 10 cadets spread out into a wider formation, surrounding me from every angle, cutting off any clear path to the edge of the ring. "Enough games," Threxer said, his voice low and controlled now, all trace of laughter gone. "Show us what you actually are." I planted my feet and let out a slow breath, feeling the familiar clarity that came in moments like this, a strange kind of calm that settled over everything once the first move had already been made, and there was nothing left to do but finish what had been started. "You already saw it," I said. "You just did not want to believe it." The third cadet came at me from behind, and I heard him before I saw him, the soft scrape of claws extending fully from beneath thick fingers, the shift in air pressure as a body twice my size closed the distance in less than a second. I pivoted on my back foot, letting his momentum carry him past me, and brought the baton down across the back of his shoulder in a strike calibrated to hit the cluster of nerves running along the base of the neck. He went down hard, sliding across the padded floor, and did not get back up. Voss had stopped calling out instructions from the observation deck. He was leaning so far over the railing now that Colonel Cross had actually reached out a hand, not to stop him, but simply because the sight of his own commander nearly falling over the edge in shock was, even in that tense moment, something that made me want to laugh. I did not laugh. I did not have time. The 4th and 5th cadets came at me together, coordinating in a way the first 3 had not, one drawing my attention high while the other went low, trying to sweep my legs out from under me. It was a good tactic, one that would have worked against most opponents who relied purely on strength to counter it. I was not most opponents. I dropped my weight low to counter the sweep, letting my own balance work against his attempt to unbalance me, and used the motion to bring the baton around in a wide arc that caught the high attacker across the outside of his knee. He crumpled instantly, the disruption pulse scrambling the signals running down through his leg, and I used the half-second of confusion from the low attacker, still recovering from a failed sweep, to deliver a second precise strike against the base of his skull, careful, measured, calibrated exactly the way the weapon's designers had intended. 5 down. The training ring, which had felt enormous when 12 cadets first surrounded me, suddenly felt much smaller, filled now with the sound of alarmed voices from the remaining 7, all of them realizing at once that whatever they had expected walking into this exercise, this was not it. Threxer had not moved from his position, watching, his eyes narrowed, calculating something I could not quite read. The remaining 7 cadets glanced toward him, waiting for a signal, waiting to see whether their leader intended to call off the exercise or push forward into something none of them had a plan for. I did not wait for his decision. 7 left, I said, my voice carrying across the training ring, calm, steady, and completely without malice. You can end this now, or we can finish the lesson. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound in the entire room was the low hum of the station's ventilation system and the ragged breathing of 5 fallen cadets, slowly, painfully, beginning to stir on the padded floor around me. I kept my grip steady on the baton, watching the remaining 7, watching Threxer most of all, waiting to see which way this moment was going to break. It broke the way I already knew it would. Threxer let out a low sound, something between a growl and a laugh, and gave a small nod to the 7 cadets still standing. It was not a signal to stop. It was a signal to continue, and I understood in that instant that pride had completely taken over any sense of caution left in the room. These were young warriors, the best of their class, chosen from thousands of applicants across a dozen worlds, and not one of them was willing to be the reason their entire group backed down from a human standing alone in the middle of a training ring. The 6th and 7th cadets moved together, flanking wide, clearly trying to learn from the mistakes of the ones who had already fallen. They kept their distance longer this time, circling instead of charging, forcing me to track 2 separate points of attack at once while conserving their energy for a coordinated strike. It was smart. It told me that whatever had just happened in front of them had shaken their confidence enough to change their approach, even if it had not shaken it enough to make them stop entirely. I kept my back angled toward the edge of the ring, refusing to let them box me into the center, where the remaining cadets could close in from all directions at once. Every step I took was deliberate, every shift of my weight calculated to keep as many of them in front of me as possible, and as few behind me as I could manage. The 6th cadet broke first, lunging forward with claws extended, and I recognized the opening for what it was, a test to see whether I would commit fully to countering him and leave myself open to the 7th cadet closing in from behind. I did not commit fully. I sidestepped just enough to let his claws pass through empty air, using the motion to bring the baton up in a short, controlled strike against the inside of his wrist as he overextended. The pulse hit him mid-lunge, and his entire arm went numb before he even finished the movement, sending him stumbling forward off balance directly into the path of his own teammate. The 7th cadet, caught off guard by his falling classmate, hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and that fraction was all I needed. I closed the distance myself this time, something none of them had expected from me yet, and delivered a quick strike to the center of his chest, right where the nerve clusters controlling his upper body converged. He staggered back, his legs already beginning to buckle, and collapsed against the padded wall of the ring with a heavy, graceless thud. 7 down, 5 remaining, and the training ring had gone quiet enough that I could hear my own heartbeat, steady and controlled, the way years of training had taught me to keep it even in moments like this one. Threxer was no longer smiling. He stood at the edge of the remaining group, watching me with an expression that had shifted from arrogance to something far more calculating, the look of a strategist reassessing an opponent he had badly misjudged. Beside him, the remaining 4 cadets shifted uneasily, glancing between their fallen classmates and the human standing in the center of the ring who was, somehow, still on her feet. "You are trained," Threxer said slowly, as though the realization was only now settling into place. "Not simply equipped, trained." "I told you that already," I said, keeping my breathing steady, my grip on the baton relaxed but ready. "You did not want to listen." He tilted his head, studying me for a long moment, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the same calculation any skilled fighter makes when they realize the fight in front of them is not the one they thought they were walking into. I half expected him to call off the remaining cadets, to accept that the lesson had been learned and there was no honor left to gain from continuing. Instead, he stepped forward himself, for the first time since our initial exchange. "Then teach me properly," he said, and the 4 remaining cadets fell back slightly, giving him space, understanding without words that their leader intended to finish this himself. I felt the shift in the room immediately. Threxer was not like the others. He moved differently, more controlled, more deliberate, clearly the product of training that went beyond simple size and aggression. He had been holding back during the earlier exchange, testing me, gathering information the same way I had been gathering information about him and his classmates. He came at me low and fast, and I barely had time to register the change in his fighting style before his hand closed around my wrist, not to strike, but to control, to try and neutralize the weapon that had already dropped 7 of his classmates. It was a smart move, and for a moment, his grip was strong enough that I felt the baton nearly slip from my fingers. I twisted my arm against the natural bend of his grip, a technique built specifically to break holds from opponents with greater raw strength, and felt his fingers loosen just enough to pull free. He recovered quickly, faster than any of the others had, and came at me again immediately, this time low, aiming for my legs, trying to take advantage of the reach and weight difference between us. I sidestepped and brought my knee up, not to strike him, but to disrupt his balance at the critical moment his weight shifted forward, and used the half-second of instability to land a precise strike against the side of his neck. It should have been enough. With any of the other cadets, it would have been enough. Threxer staggered but did not fall. He straightened up slowly, shaking his head as though clearing static from his vision, and looked at me with something that was no longer arrogance or even calculation. It was recognition, the kind of respect that only comes from someone who has genuinely been tested and found themselves matched against something they did not expect. "Impressive," he said, his voice rougher now, strained from the disruption pulse still working through his system. "But you will need more than one strike to finish this." He was right, and I knew it. Vorath physiology was built differently: denser nervous systems, greater resistance to disruption, all the things I had read in briefing documents that suddenly felt very real standing in front of a cadet who had just absorbed a strike that dropped every one of his classmates in a single hit. I did not have the luxury of overthinking it. He came at me again, faster this time, clearly done underestimating what I was capable of, and I found myself moving on pure instinct, drawing on years of training that had prepared me for exactly this kind of moment, a fight where speed and precision were the only real advantages I had left. I ducked beneath a strike aimed at my shoulder, felt the air displace above my head, and drove the baton upward in a strike aimed at the underside of his jaw, one of the few points on Vorath anatomy where the nervous system ran close enough to the surface to guarantee a strong response even against their natural resilience. The pulse hit, and this time his legs finally gave out. Threxer dropped to one knee, his hand braced against the padded floor, breathing hard, and for a long moment neither of us moved. The remaining 4 cadets stood frozen at the edge of the ring, watching their leader kneeling in front of a human who had just, one by one, taken down every single member of their elite training class without ever raising the weapon above the setting rated safe for non-lethal use. I stepped back, giving him space, giving all of them space, and lowered the baton to my side. "This lesson is over," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent training ring, "unless any of you would like to continue it." The 4 remaining cadets looked at each other, then at Threxer, still kneeling on the padded floor, then at the 7 of their classmates scattered around the ring, slowly beginning to recover from the disruption pulses that had dropped them minutes earlier. Nobody stepped forward, nobody said a word. Above us, on the observation deck, the silence was just as complete. Commander Voss stood frozen at the railing, his arms no longer folded, his expression somewhere between disbelief and something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. Colonel Cross stood beside him, and though I could not see his face clearly from where I stood, I could tell from his posture that he was doing everything in his power not to smile. Threxer pushed himself back to his feet slowly, his movements stiff, his breathing still uneven from the strike that had finally brought him down. He looked at me for a long moment, and I braced myself, unsure whether wounded pride would push him toward another attempt, or whether the lesson had finally landed the way it was supposed to. He surprised me. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin, and in front of every cadet still standing or lying on the floor of that training ring, he bowed his head toward me, a gesture I recognized from the cultural briefings, as one reserved exclusively for opponents, a Vorath warrior considered worthy of respect. "I was wrong," he said simply, his translated voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "About your species, about this weapon, about you." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing at all. I simply nodded back, a small, quiet acknowledgement between 2 people who had, in the span of a few violent minutes, completely rewritten what they thought they understood about each other. Behind Threxer, the 11 other cadets, some still sitting where they had fallen, some just beginning to stand, watched the exchange in complete silence. I could see it in their eyes, the same shift I had seen in Threxer's, the slow, uncomfortable realization that everything their culture had taught them about strength and weakness, about predators and prey, had just been challenged by a human standing alone in the center of their own training ring. Above us, Commander Voss finally found his voice, though it came out quieter than I had heard him speak since I arrived on Meridian Station. "Someone get the medical team down here," he said, and though his words were directed at the staff standing near the observation deck controls, his eyes never left me. "And someone find out exactly what kind of training program produces instructors like this one." I lowered the baton fully and let out a slow breath, feeling the adrenaline that had carried me through the last several minutes finally begin to fade, leaving behind the familiar ache of muscles that had been pushed harder than they let on during the fight itself. 12 cadets, all 12 down, recovering, and every single one of them still breathing, still whole, exactly as the weapon in my hand had been designed to guarantee. I looked around the ring one final time, at the cadets slowly helping each other up, at Threxer watching me with an expression I could only describe as genuine curiosity now that the arrogance had burned away, and I understood that whatever happened next, on this station or between our two species, had just changed in ways that would take a long time to fully understand. The training ring, silent just moments before, slowly filled with the sound of low voices as the cadets began speaking to each other, not in mockery this time, but in something that sounded very much like disbelief mixed with grudging respect. I caught fragments of translated words drifting across the room, questions about the weapon, questions about human training methods, questions about whether every soldier from my world was capable of what they had just witnessed. I did not have answers for all of them. I was not sure anyone did, not yet. What I did know, standing there in the center of that ring with a small, unremarkable weapon still resting in my hand, was that the story of what happened in this room was not going to stay contained to a single training exercise on a single station. Word would travel, the way it always did among warriors who valued strength and respected only what they had personally seen tested and proven. And when it did, it would carry a lesson that no briefing document or diplomatic meeting could ever have delivered quite as effectively as 12 fallen cadets and one human instructor who never once needed to raise her voice. The medical team arrived within minutes, a mix of Vorath physicians and 2 human specialists assigned to the exchange program, moving quickly between the recovering cadets with handheld scanners that chirped softly as they confirmed what I already knew. No lasting damage, no broken bones, no internal injuries, nothing beyond temporary disruption to the nervous system that would fade completely within the hour. The weapon had done exactly what it was designed to do, and the results scrolling across every scanner in the room were the clearest proof anyone could have asked for. I stood off to the side while they worked, watching the cadets slowly recover their strength, watching the way they looked at me now, no longer with mockery but with something far more complicated. Threxor sat on the edge of the ring, allowing a physician to check the readings from the strike that had finally brought him down. And even from a distance I could see him watching me with the same calculating expression he had worn during our exchange, though the calculation now seemed to be pointed in a very different direction. Colonel Cross made his way down from the observation deck, moving through the training ring with the easy confidence of a man who had just watched something he intended to enjoy for a very long time. He stopped beside me, glancing around at the scene, 12 elite cadets scattered across the room in various stages of recovery, and let out a low breath that was not quite a laugh but was clearly fighting to become one. "Sullivan," he said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that only I could hear it. "You want to explain to me why the report I have to file is going to say you dropped an entire class of Vorath Predator cadets using a weapon rated for crowd control." "They asked for a demonstration, sir," I said, matching his tone. "I demonstrated." He shook his head, and this time the laugh did break through, quiet and controlled, the kind of laugh a man allows himself only when he is fairly certain no one important is watching. "Remind me never to volunteer you for anything I actually want to go smoothly." Before I could respond, Commander Voss arrived, descending from the observation deck with none of the easy confidence he had carried when the exercise began. He moved through the ring slowly, studying each of his cadets in turn, and when he finally stopped in front of me, I saw an expression on his face that I had not expected to see from him at any point during this assignment. It was humility. "Instructor Sullivan," he said, his translated voice carrying a weight it had not held before, "I owe you an apology, and my cadets owe you considerably more than that." "No apology necessary, Commander," I said. "You wanted a demonstration of human training methods. I gave you one." "You gave us considerably more than that," Voss said, glancing back at the cadets, several of whom were now standing on their own, watching the exchange between their instructor and the human who had just handed them the most humbling lesson of their training. "I have served in this Dominion's military for 30 years. I have fought on 3 different border conflicts. I have never seen 12 of our finest cadets defeated by a single opponent using a weapon that did not draw a single drop of blood." "That was the point," I said. "Strength is not only measured by what you are willing to destroy. Sometimes it is measured by what you are capable of destroying and choose not to." Voss was quiet for a long moment, considering that, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, the same slow recalculation I had seen happen in Threxer during our own exchange. It was the look of someone reassessing an entire framework of belief, built over decades, in the span of a single unexpected afternoon. "We were told humans favored negotiation over combat," Voss said finally, "that your species preferred to avoid conflict wherever possible." "We do prefer that," I said. "It does not mean we are incapable of conflict when it becomes necessary. It means we choose our battles carefully, and we make sure that when we do fight, we are prepared well enough that the fight does not need to last very long." Threxor had made his way over during the conversation, moving stiffly but steadily, and stopped a respectful distance away, waiting for a pause in the exchange before speaking. When Voss glanced toward him and gave a small nod of permission, Threxor stepped forward. "Instructor Sullivan," he said, and I noticed the shift in how he addressed me now, formal, where before it had been dismissive. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why send a single instructor? Why not a larger team, more suited to handling 12 cadets at once, in case something like this occurred?" It was a fair question, and I considered my answer carefully before speaking. "Because the exercise was never really about combat training," I said. "It was about trust. My commanders needed to know whether a single human, properly trained, could handle a room full of people who did not respect her at first. And your commanders needed to see it happen, rather than simply being told it was possible." Voss's expression tightened slightly at that, understanding settling into place. "This was a test," he said slowly, "not simply for my cadets, for all of us. Every exchange between our 2 species is a test, Commander," I said, "whether we call it that or not." Colonel Cross stepped in at that point, his tone shifting into something more official, the easy humor from a moment before tucked away behind the professional demeanor he wore for conversations that mattered. "Commander Voss, I think it's worth being direct with you. There is a reason humanity agreed to send instructors for this exchange program, beyond simple cooperation between our governments." Voss studied him carefully. "Go on." "The threat building along the outer border systems, the one neither of our governments has spoken about publicly yet, is not something either of our species can face alone," Cross said. "Your Dominion has strength in numbers and raw power that Earth cannot match. We have discipline, precision, and a willingness to use restraint until restraint is no longer the right choice. Neither approach works completely on its own against what is coming. Both approaches, combined, might." The training ring had gone quiet again, the recovering cadets listening closely even as their physicians continued checking their readings, and I understood in that moment that Colonel Cross had just said something far more significant than he usually allowed himself to say in front of Dominion personnel. Voss was silent for a long moment, processing the weight of what had just been shared with him. "You believe my cadets, and instructors like Sullivan here, will need to fight alongside each other eventually, not simply train alongside each other." "I believe it's already becoming necessary," Cross said. And I believe what happened in this ring today is exactly the kind of lesson both our species needed to learn before that day arrives. Your cadets needed to understand that human restraint is not the same as human weakness. And my instructor needed to prove, to herself as much as to anyone else, that she could hold her own against opponents who outmatch her in every physical category on paper. I felt the weight of that statement settle over me, understanding for the first time the full scope of what this assignment had actually been about. This had never been a simple demonstration. It had been a proving ground, deliberately constructed, deliberately dangerous, built to answer questions that neither government had been willing to ask directly. Threxer looked between Cross and Voss, then back at me, and something in his expression shifted into a kind of grim understanding that made him look older than his years for just a moment. "Then I am glad this lesson happened here," he said quietly, "and not somewhere it would have mattered more." "So am I," said. Voss straightened, some of his earlier composure returning, though it carried a different quality now, less arrogance and more genuine respect. "Instructor Sullivan, on behalf of my cadets, and on behalf of the Dominion Training Command, I would like to formally request that you continue this program beyond the single demonstration originally scheduled. If what Colonel Cross says is true, my cadets need considerably more of what you just taught them than a single afternoon can provide." I glanced at Colonel Cross, who gave the smallest nod, confirmation that this request had likely been anticipated, perhaps even hoped for, long before I ever stepped into that training ring. "I would be glad to," I said. Threxer, still standing nearby, allowed himself a small, tired smile, the first genuine expression of warmth I had seen from him since our confrontation began. "Then perhaps next time," he said, "you will teach us how to avoid being on the receiving end of that lesson." "Perhaps," I said, "though I suspect some lessons need to be felt at least once before they can truly be learned." Around the ring, several of the other cadets, listening to the exchange, allowed themselves quiet laughter, the tension of the last hour finally beginning to ease into something more like camaraderie. It was a strange thing to witness, the shift from hostility to something approaching mutual respect, all of it built on the foundation of a fight that had lasted only a few short minutes, but had clearly reshaped how an entire class of elite cadets understood the species they had been trained, for their whole lives, to consider beneath them. As the medical team finished their final checks, and the cadets slowly began filing out of the training ring, still murmuring among themselves, still glancing back toward me with expressions I was only beginning to learn how to read, Colonel Cross fell into step beside me, heading toward the corridor that led back to the human quarters of the station. "You know," he said quietly, once we were far enough from the others that our conversation would not carry, "when I put your name forward for this assignment, half of command back home thought I was making a mistake. And the other half? The other half knew exactly what you were capable of," he said. "I just don't think any of us expected the Vorath to learn that lesson quite this fast, or quite this thoroughly." I looked back over my shoulder at the training ring, now empty except for the last of the medical staff finishing their reports, and thought about the look on Threxer's face when he had finally understood that everything he believed about strength needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. "They needed to learn it," I said. "Better here, in a training ring where nobody was in real danger, than somewhere out on the border where the stakes are considerably higher." Colonel Cross nodded slowly, and for a moment neither of us said anything else, simply walking together through the quiet corridors of Meridian Station, both of us aware that whatever had happened in that training ring was only the beginning of something much larger, something that neither of our species could fully see the shape of yet, but that both of us understood was already, quietly, beginning to arrive. 3 weeks passed before I understood exactly how far the story of that afternoon had traveled. I found out by accident, standing in the mess hall on Meridian Station, when a group of Vorath officers I had never met before stopped talking the moment I walked in, and one of them, an older woman with silver markings along her jaw that signaled decades of command experience, rose from her seat and approached me directly. "You are the human they call the 12 Breaker," she said, without any preamble, studying me with open curiosity. I nearly laughed. Nobody had told me the cadets had given me a nickname, let alone one that had apparently spread far enough to reach officers who had never set foot in that training ring. "I did not choose that name," I said, "but I suppose I understand where it came from." Cadet Threxer's account of the exercise has been shared across 3 different training commands, she said. There is some debate about whether the details have been exaggerated in the retelling. "They have not been exaggerated," I said simply. She studied me for a long moment, the way Threxer had studied me on that first day, searching for something behind my calm, ordinary appearance that might explain what 12 of her Dominion's finest cadets could not. Eventually she gave a short nod, the kind of gesture I had come to understand as respect among the Vorath, and returned to her table without another word. That was how it began. Not with a grand announcement or a formal ceremony, but with quiet conversations spreading through mess halls and training decks across the station, then across other stations, carried by cadets who had transferred out, by officers who had reviewed the incident reports, by anyone who found the story compelling enough to repeat. Within a month, I had been asked to speak with training commanders from 4 different Dominion fleets, all of them wanting to understand exactly what kind of program had produced an instructor capable of doing what I had done. Colonel Cross found the entire situation deeply amusing, though he was careful never to let that amusement show in front of Dominion officials. He told me once, over a quiet dinner in the human quarters, that the report he filed after that first demonstration had been forwarded up the chain of command faster than anything he had submitted in 15 years of service, and that Earth Defense Command had already begun drafting proposals to expand the exchange program based almost entirely on what had happened in that single training ring. "You realize you've become something of a legend," he said, not entirely joking. "I dropped 12 cadets with a non-lethal weapon," I said. "That is not exactly the stuff legends are usually made of." "On your world, maybe not," he said. "On theirs, it apparently is." The cadets themselves changed the most in the weeks that followed, and I found myself paying close attention to that change during the training sessions Commander Voss had arranged for me to continue leading. Threxer, in particular, approached every lesson with a focus and humility that had been completely absent during our first meeting. He asked careful questions now, questions that showed he had spent considerable time thinking through what had happened, questions about technique and mindset, rather than simply about the mechanics of the weapon I had used against him. "You never once lost control," he said to me one afternoon, after a lesson focused on maintaining composure under pressure. "Even when we surrounded you, even when I held your weapon, you never once allowed fear to change how you moved." "I felt fear," I admitted. "Anyone standing in that position would have. The difference is not whether you feel it, the difference is whether you let it decide what happens next." He considered that carefully, the way he considered most things now, and nodded slowly. "On my world, we are taught that fear is weakness, something to be eliminated entirely through strength and confidence. On my world, we are taught that fear is information," I said. "It tells you something matters. What you do with that information determines whether it makes you weaker or stronger." It was during one of these later sessions, nearly 2 months after the original incident, that the deeper purpose behind Colonel Cross's earlier warning became suddenly, urgently clear. I was midway through a lesson on defensive positioning when the alarms across Meridian Station began sounding, a pattern I recognized immediately from my briefing materials as a border incursion alert, the kind reserved for contact with forces from beyond the edge of known Dominion territory. The training ring emptied within minutes, cadets and instructors alike moving toward their designated stations, and I found myself standing beside Threxer and several other cadets in the station's secondary command center, watching a live feed from a Dominion patrol vessel stationed along the outer border, the same border Colonel Cross had referenced weeks earlier, without ever fully explaining what threat he had been describing. The feed showed something moving through the dark space beyond the patrol vessel's sensor range, something large, something that did not respond to any of the standard hailing protocols used across a dozen different species and star systems. Commander Voss stood at the center of the command deck, coordinating with officers from 3 different departments, his voice steady but carrying an urgency I had not heard from him before. "Contact confirmed," one of the sensor operators called out. "Unknown configuration. Signature does not match anything in the Dominion database." I glanced at Threxer, standing rigid beside me, his earlier calm replaced by something sharper, more focused. "This is it," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "The thing your colonel spoke of." "We do not know that yet," I said, though I could feel my own pulse quickening at the possibility. The unknown contact held its position for several tense minutes, close enough to the patrol vessel that every sensor operator on the command deck watched with unbroken attention, before finally withdrawing back into the darkness beyond the border, vanishing from every scanner nearly as quickly as it had appeared. The tension in the room did not fade with its departure. If anything, it deepened, the silence afterward carrying more weight than the alarm had carried before. Commander Voss turned away from the display and addressed the room, his voice carrying to every officer and cadet present. "This marks the fourth such contact reported along this section of the border in the past 6 months. Each encounter has followed the same pattern: brief contact, no communication, immediate withdrawal." "Reconnaissance," Threxer said quietly, and Voss nodded in confirmation. "That is our current assessment," Voss said. "Whatever is watching our border is not yet ready to make itself known fully. But it is watching, and it is learning, the same way we would if our positions were reversed." I thought back to that conversation with Colonel Cross weeks earlier, standing in the corridor outside the training ring, discussing a threat that neither government had been willing to name directly. I understood now, with a clarity that settled uncomfortably in my chest, exactly why humanity had agreed to send instructors into the heart of Dominion training programs, and exactly why Commander Voss had been so eager to see human methods tested against his own cadets. This had never simply been about cultural exchange or diplomatic goodwill. It had been preparation, quiet and deliberate, for something both our governments could see coming, long before either was willing to say its name aloud, in front of the people who would eventually need to face it. Later that evening, standing on the observation deck overlooking the same training ring where 12 cadets had once surrounded me with nothing more than arrogance and misplaced confidence, I found Threxer waiting for me, his posture different now, more settled, more purposeful than I had ever seen it. "I used to believe strength meant never needing help from anyone," he said, without turning to look at me, "that relying on another species, especially one physically weaker than my own, was itself a kind of weakness. And now?" He turned to face me fully, and for the first time since I had met him, I saw something in his expression that looked less like a predator sizing up prey, and more like an equal recognizing another equal. "Now I understand that the strongest warriors are not the ones who refuse help. They are the ones wise enough to know when they need it, and disciplined enough to accept it without their pride getting in the way." I thought about that for a long moment, watching the empty training ring below us, remembering the sound of 12 cadets hitting the padded floor one after another, remembering the look on Threxer's face when he had finally understood that everything he believed about strength needed rebuilding. "That is not a lesson everyone learns easily," I said. "No," he agreed. "It is not. I am grateful you were patient enough to teach it anyway, even when I gave you every reason not to be." I offered him a small smile, one that carried more warmth than I expected to feel towards someone who had, only 2 months earlier, grabbed my weapon in front of 11 of his classmates and dared me to prove myself worthy of respect. "That is what instructors are for," I said, "teaching lessons that matter, even when the students resist them at first." Word of that day continued to spread long after the immediate excitement faded, carried across Dominion fleets, and eventually back to Earth itself, where it became something of a quiet legend within human military circles, a story told to new recruits about restraint, about discipline, and about the kind of strength that does not need to destroy in order to prove itself. Somewhere along the border, in the dark space beyond Dominion territory, something continued watching, patient and unknown, waiting for whatever moment it had decided would be right to reveal itself fully. But when that moment came, Whenever it finally arrived, it would find two species standing together instead of two species standing apart, bound not by treaties written on paper, but by a lesson taught in a quiet training ring on Meridian Station, where a single human instructor had shown 12 of the galaxy's finest young predators that true strength was never about how hard you could strike. It was about knowing, with absolute certainty, exactly when to hold back, and exactly when not to.